Hi. So, about a month ago, I made a video about a YouTuber called Travelingisrael, where I critiqued a handful of his takes on the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Specifically, I took issue with his framing of Deir Yassin, the Battle of Haifa, and his interpretation of Zionist attitudes towards the forced transfer, i.e., expulsion, of Arabs. And not too long ago, he responded with a half-hour video arguing that it is in fact I who is wrong. Now, when you get a call out like this, especially when it's from a bigger channel, the first response is, oh no, my reputation, my credibility, my facts. I mean, I thought I was quite careful. I made sure my claims were sourced. I put up my references on the screen. I eventually remembered to list them in the description as well. Sorry for the delay. And I steered clear of using any partisan anti-Zionist sources. Because it's good to know the audience. You might have noticed that finding impartial sources for this topic can feel almost impossible. Maybe you're trying to follow the current events, but you have no idea where to start. And that's where I'd recommend using Ground News. Ground News compiles articles from thousands of sources in just one place, giving you access to a wide variety of perspectives, including ones that you might have never thought to look at. It shows you if there is any media bias surrounding a particular story, and if you're needing to go through stories quickly, they also give you a very useful summary at the top of the page. Ground News also allows you to customize your feed by following specific topics. As for Israel and Palestine, almost half of the coverage is currently coming from the right, suggesting there might be certain aspects of the war that aren't being proportionately covered. For example, this article, which argues that the United States' plan to revitalize the Palestinian Authority in Gaza after the war is doomed to fail. In a world of intense bias and partisanship, Ground News helps you to cut through the bias and hold the media accountable. So, go to ground.news/learnerbox where you can sign up for free, or you can subscribe with a 30% discount to get unlimited access. Big thanks to Ground News for making this video possible. So, what did I get wrong? Well, I want you guys to experience this reaction the same way I did for the first time, so here's how he starts.
He starts by talking a bit about my channel, which is a smart thing to do. To get a good overview, I did the same for his channel and found a lot of pro-Palestinian videos and pro-trans movement videos. Now, this is a really strange combination. I've actually already made a video about this weird progressive Arab love-hate relationship. Progressives love to side with the Palestinians, while the Palestinians hate everything about the progressive, notably the trans movement.
So this part has nothing to do with my video, but I do think it deserves a response. The whole point of human rights is that you tend to support them regardless of what those people believe. My criticisms of certain Israeli actions in the 1948 war or thereafter have nothing to do with my positions on how they or the Palestinians approach LGBT rights. Likewise, when I make videos calling out left-wingers who support Hamas, October 7th denial, all those things, that doesn't mean I'm implicitly endorsing everything Israel does. Everyone understands this. If I bring up a story of, say, the Pakistani government forcing out nearly 400,000 Afghan refugees, pushing them straight into the hands of the Taliban government that they were fleeing, it would be pretty weird if someone's response to that was, sorry, but as a progressive, you do understand that most of those Afghans probably don't support gender-affirming care, right? This is a ridiculous argument. I don't know why people make it. I don't know why people think it's a clever thing to say. I'm sure there are some people out there who think Palestinians have progressive views on queer rights. I'm not one of them, so yeah, this part makes no sense. But it wouldn't be fair to say his entire response is like this. There are a few other weird tangents like this, but he does directly contest me on the factual grounds at least a few times. And when I say a few times, I really mean once. You can check out both videos if you don't believe me, but in this whole response, he only challenges me on the facts of the matter one time. So let's start with that. In my video, I spoke about the Deir Yassin peace pact and showed a timeline of all the efforts made by the villagers to uphold that pact, all the way up until April 4th, 5 days before they were attacked. Traveling Israel responded with this.
Fighters from Deir Yassin attacked Jewish neighborhoods on the 2nd of April, and some of them went on attacking the castle on the 8th of April. There was a peace pact, but it was broken at least twice. If you look at a map, you will see that Deir Yassin sits on a hill right next to the main road to Jerusalem within the valley. So, seen from a strategic military point of view, there was clear justification for conquering the village.
Okay, good. So here it looks like we have a dispute. My own research found that Deir Yassin's leaders had been staying faithful to the peace pact at around the same time the attack was being proposed. And I did also make a few other arguments around this, but we'll come back to those in a minute. In his response, Traveling Israel argues that there had been sniper shots fired from the village on April 2nd, and then on the 8th, a group of men from Deir Yassin went to fight in a nearby village called Kastel. On this basis, he argues, and based on its location near the Jerusalem road, Deir Yassin was clearly a justified target. So it seems like we have contradictory information here. Well, maybe. For these claims, Traveling Israel recommended a few sources. The most recent one he points out is a book from 2021 called Deir Yassin, The Massacre That Never Was, and in the description, he links 2 videos from the book's author. Now, according to Traveling Israel, a lot of this book is based on witness statements, both from the attackers and from the survivors, and that would make sense. Unfortunately, a lot of the relevant documents for Deir Yassin were closed by the Israeli government at some point in the mid-2000s, so I only say that because some people were saying that my sources were less valid because they were older, but no, that argument doesn't really work here. In any case, I managed to get a copy of this book for myself, and it does confirm some of what Traveling Israel is saying. Some. It does say that there were sniper shots fired at the village on April 2nd. On April 4th, the author mentions that the village leaders had once again rejected Arab irregulars who were trying to use it as a base, and that they had done this because they didn't want to endanger their relationship with the Jews, which matches what I'd read. Then, on April 5th, we can see that a group of men from Deir Yassin had left the village to go and fight in Kastel. And since Traveling Israel doesn't mention it, the number of men who left to join in that battle was a grand total of 12. And according to his source, only some of them would return to Deir Yassin on the evening of the 8th, just a few hours before the village was attacked. But this does suggest that although the leaders were seemingly trying to keep the peace, they were not able to control everyone, and there was at least some hostility coming from the village. So that's it. The peace pact was over, and Deir Yassin was fair game. Get f***ed, loner box. Get a job. Cuck. Well, almost. First of all, I'll admit this was a mistake. The source I had used for this timeline unfortunately didn't mention either of these things. As I looked into it further, I found that the same author had actually mentioned these 2 events in another book just a few years later, so I'll happily own that. However, I also noticed that this same author, despite acknowledging these 2 events, was still describing Deir Yassin as militarily insignificant and the attack as not much of a battle. So, what is happening here? I imagine some of the less hawkish people in the audience might be looking at this and thinking, is this really a good enough reason to declare the peace pact over, send a bunch of inexperienced teenage extremists to take over the village, and expel all the inhabitants? Well, if you were thinking that, it turns out the heads of Israel's regular army at the time agreed with you. What Traveling Israel has chosen not to mention, and this is from the book he recommended, is that just 2 or 3 days before the attack, the Haganah commander, David Shaltiel, had rejected the paramilitary group's plan because he considered Deir Yassin a quiet village constituting no security threat, arguing that the attack was pointless and that there were more important targets. He instead suggested that the Irgun and Lehi help in the Battle of Kastel, and he even offered to supply them with arms. This, of course, would make sense because, if you remember, the few people in Deir Yassin who did seem to want to fight had just recently gone there themselves. Then, on the 7th of April, 2 days before the attack, Yitzhak Levy, who was the commander of Haganah intelligence in Jerusalem, also protested against the plan, specifically citing the peace agreement with the village. One Haganah official, once again citing the peace agreement as his reason, seemed to have disliked the plans so much that he may have even offered to fire on Etzel and Lehi in order to stop them. And I did mention some of this in my last video, but that last one was actually new to me, so I appreciate the recommendation. Anyway, the reason the attack on Deir Yassin was eventually given the go-ahead was not because of any convincing arguments about a broken peace pact. It was because Ergun and Lehi had stubbornly refused to accept any alternative plan. In part, they were insistent on it because they wanted to prevent any partitioning of Jerusalem and to widen the war beyond what was planned by the Zionist leaders. In the commander's eyes, they would have attacked it with or without his approval, and the green light was only given as a way of maintaining some form of authority over them. Remember, for the Jews, 1948 was not just a war for territory. It was a war of survival, and the last thing they needed was a fight with their own men. In the commander's own words, "I have enough trouble as it is. I couldn't shoot them in the back. They are Jews, you know." So in his video where he says Deir Yassin was clearly a justified military target, or in his older one where he says it was clear to both sides that the local peace pact was no longer relevant, well, no longer relevant to whom exactly? It was clearly still relevant to the commanders and intelligence leaders of Israel's regular forces. In fact, the only people who seemed to agree with him at the time were the Ergun and Lehi. In other words, the two most extreme right-wing paramilitary groups in the Zionist forces. The guys who, in the late 30s, had responded to Arab violence by setting off massive bombs in crowded town centers, indiscriminately killing and maiming dozens of people at a time. In fact, as far as this particular practice in Israel-Palestine goes, these guys were the pioneers. And these are the people who believed that Deir Yassin was a justified target. Not the heads of intelligence, not the commanders, the terrorists. This is the only point in the entire video where Traveling Israel attempts to dispute me on factual grounds, and somehow he still managed to get it wrong. Even decades afterwards, in 1971, Levi and another Haganah leader both stood firm by this position. Even then, Levi reiterated that Deir Yassin was a quiet village that did not take part in the 1948 war, just like he said when he was head of intelligence. So maybe that's just a sticking point. I happen to agree with the head of intelligence from Israel's regular forces on this issue, and Traveling Israel happens to agree with the terrorists. And that, I think, is the only example of him sincerely engaging in what I was saying in my video. As for the rest of it, well, let's just go through some examples. In his section on Deir Yassin, he shows part of a documentary where Arab figures admit that they exaggerated the events as they happened in 1948. I don't know why he's presenting this as if it's some kind of rebuttal to anything I'm saying. My own video specifically mentions this exact same point. What I also mention here, and incidentally what Traveling Israel leaves out for some reason, is the fact that although most of the exaggeration was made by the Arabs, it was also exaggerated by pretty much everyone. The Ergun initially claimed that around 250 people had died, and they did this explicitly because they wanted to strike fear into the surrounding villages and push them to flee. They bragged about how the spread of the news was pushing people to run away. Only 3 days after the massacre, Lehi members had told Haganah intelligence about the barbaric behavior of the Ergun towards the prisoners and the dead, adding that a number of Arab girls had been raped and murdered. Traveling Israel seems happy to call out the Arab leaders for exaggerating the events, and rightly so, but when the Zionists did it, well, I guess if you only watched his video, you would never know. But you might be wondering, why is this book called The Massacre That Never Was? And why is Traveling Israel so insistent on calling it the Battle of Deir Yassin instead?
I called it the Battle of Deir Yassin, whereas he calls it the Massacre of Deir Yassin, which actually very clearly demonstrates the power of language and different narratives.
Well, why they're choosing to do this, I'm not so sure of. Because apart from a couple of small details, the author's position on what exactly happened after the battle wasn't too different from how I'd understood it. He states that at least 23 people were killed after the fighting had stopped, although that number could be a little higher. And out of the 101 deaths logged by the author, he states that only 24 of them were combatants. Which does make me wonder about Traveling Israel's choice of words here.
In the aftermath of that battle, there were 5 Jews dead and about 100 Arabs dead. Of those Arabs who died, many were fighters, but some were civilians who had hidden in their houses.
I'm sorry, what was that again about the power of language? 24 out of 101 counts as many, whilst the 37 civilians who died during the fighting count as some? Okay. In any case, these are mostly civilians, and we have around 23 plus people killed after the battle was over. But neither the author nor Traveling Israel seemed to want to call this a massacre. And really, it seems like the debate here is just semantic. Obviously, there are other Israeli historians who take the other side of it.
Whatever happened is a number of atrocities, in which people died, and accompanying it were atrocities, a series of separate atrocities, in which a family was shot here, a family was blown up in a house there, all together amounting to 110 deaths. I would say that the word massacre is correct, but in a larger series of atrocities, with several tens of people killed not in battle, amounts to a massacre, even if it isn't a classic, burning people along the wall and shooting them.
So, I guess that's it. Maybe for some people, a massacre has to be an event where, in a premeditated fashion, you line up hundreds of people, blindfold them, shoot them, and then throw them in a hole, which isn't what happened here, nor have I ever claimed it was. But personally, I would argue that what really matters here is whether or not people are killed after the battle. That would be what separates the battles from, the massacres. And what's interesting is that the author of Traveling Israel's source seems to think something kind of similar. In the very last page of his book, after listing the incidents where people were killed after the battle, he closes with this paragraph. There is a substantial difference between people killed during fighting and a massacre. Except for the specific incidents listed above, people in Deir Yassin were killed, not massacred. Well, okay. So the specific incidents listed where people were definitely not killed during the fighting, that was what? A massacre, perhaps? No, I hate semantic arguments. We're moving on. At a later point in his video, Traveling Israel points out that I spoke a lot about various Zionist leaders in 1948 and their shortcomings, but not about the Arab leaders. And why would I do that? Again, I feel like my reason for doing that in this video should be obvious, but he has a different opinion.
But as I was thinking about it, I came up with a much better, more important point to make. One that I'm not sure Lonobox thought of. In his video, he mentions the specific names of Israeli leaders many times. He mentions Ben-Gurion about 10 times, Menachem Begin a few times, Yitzhak Rabin, and others. But not once does he mention the names of the leaders of the Arabs in Palestine. Don't you think that it is a bit strange that in a 46 minutes video about the war, he goes into the smallest details, yet he doesn't mention the names of any Arab leaders? Of course, I don't know why Lonobox made this priority, but I do want to make an educated guess that might explain it. Could it be that it is important to him to depict the Palestinians as victims? There is no higher virtue than victimhood in the progressive chart, and because they are poor victims who have no control over their lives, they were subjected to atrocities perpetrated by the evil Israelis. This seems to be the narrative Lonobox wants to promote.
Wait, really? Is that what I do? Little old me? So, in case you didn't know, I have no issue calling out the shortcomings of the pro-Palestinian side. My live channel definitely has no shortage of that. Even on this channel, the last video I did on Israel-Palestine before the Traveling Israel one was about Gaza, where I mentioned plenty of phases where I thought the Arabs were at fault. I mentioned the fact that Gaza's Jewish population had to be evacuated in the 1920s as a result of Arab riots. I mentioned the Hebron massacre, even though that didn't happen in Gaza. I make no secret of the fact that Fedayeen fighters were very much okay with attacking civilians. And yes, when I talk about Gaza from the 1980s onwards, I do in fact condemn Hamas. And just for good measure, here is known far-left streamer Hassan Piker describing that video as Israeli propaganda.
In this 100-year history, there's a lot of aspects that of the story that I think get left out in his argument that that certainly makes it seem like Israel is maybe not a small being, but like had to do this stuff. And the security concerns have always been the reason why Israel justifies what it does. So, in my opinion, stating that without talking about how fucking utterly ridiculous and inhumane it is, okay, is basically doing, a Israeli propaganda pretty much.
So it seems like Traveling Israel is making this judgment based on what? One video? Which is admittedly very focused on criticizing Zionist leaders. But in case you didn't notice, the video was called Traveling Israel is Wrong About the Nakba. It was not called A Comprehensive History of the Entire 48 War. Obviously, if I disagree with things Traveling Israel has said, I'm going to focus on those disagreements. I doubt, for example, that me and him would have much to disagree about when it comes to someone like al-Husseini. I have nothing nice to say about al-Husseini. Nor do I have any kind words for people who say shit like this. So, no. I have no incentive to prevent my audience from learning about people like al-Husseini. You know, those are the perks of not being a propagandist. So, it seems like this educated guess is actually more of an uneducated guess. Ooh. Okay, let's move on to the section on Haifa. So in this part, he does at least admit to getting one thing wrong. Well, barely. He admits that he mixed up the names of two Jewish leaders who were in charge of Haifa before and after the battle, so, I mean, that's not a big deal. But obviously this wasn't my entire argument. Believe it or not, this was not a 12-minute segment of me just gloating about him getting a name wrong. That would be silly. As for the rest of what I had to say, he just completely ignores it. In Traveling Israel's summary, Haifa was an event in the 48 War where after winning the battle, the Jewish leaders had asked the Arabs to stay. The Arab leaders, however, called for an evacuation, and within just a few months, the Arab population in Haifa fell from 70,000 to less than 4,000. Now, in my video I mentioned all of this, but I also added a few important caveats. One, that the Zionist assault on Haifa employed both indiscriminate attacks and psychological warfare, which resulted in 15,000 people fleeing before any Jewish leader was asking them to stay. Two, that the Jewish leaders who did want the Arabs to stay were completely disempowered after the battle, and the city was placed under the military rule of people who absolutely didn't give a fuck about asking Arabs to stay, and many of whom actually preferred them gone. He doesn't address the fact that Moshe Carmel, the Haganah commander who was in charge of Haifa after the battle, was a notorious military leader who also led Operation Hiram, where 5, possibly even 6 massacres were committed in less than 3 days. And 3, that many of the Jewish leaders who wanted the Arabs to stay only took about a week to change their minds after they had become sold on the idea of living in a Jewish majority city. Traveling Israel doesn't engage with any of this, nor does he have anything to say about my response to this take.
The Battle of Haifa is the best example of what really happened to the Arabs in the war and how they came to be refugees.
Of course, this is nonsense. Haifa is actually a relatively unique example from the war. From nearly 400 towns and villages that were depopulated in the war, Haifa was only one of 6 where Arab orders was a decisive cause of abandonment. And even in that case, it was only one of 2 decisive causes, the other being this one. So, for a second time, why does Traveling Israel think this is the best example of what happened to the Arabs in the 48 War? Because it definitely doesn't indicate any kind of trend, and since we're offering educated guesses now, maybe it's the best example to him because it shifts the blame of the refugee problem onto the Arabs. It's the example that makes Israel look good. Provided you ignore some of the details, obviously. Now, I cannot read Traveling Israel's mind in the same way that he thinks he can read mine, but looking at the way he addresses this last part, it is a bit tempting. In my video, I took issue with him saying this.
It is claimed in the video that it sends a message to the West that people could be easily removed. Who sends a message? The Zionist movement never said anything about removing non-Jews from the land. On the contrary, the Zionist movement said very clearly that all people from all religions could be granted their human rights.
Now, I'm going to keep this quote up on the screen just so we don't forget which argument we're actually addressing. I pointed out that this is an unbelievably dishonest thing to say. In his video, he even shows a quote that I used from Israel's first prime minister when he was explicitly endorsing the idea of transfer. Transfer, which again is just a euphemism for expulsion. For good measure, I could also show him saying that he doesn't see anything unethical about transfer. And I can also give you a handful of quotes from other Zionist leaders saying something similar. I also made it clear that you don't necessarily need a top-down expulsion policy in order to achieve a similar outcome, so long as leaders are able to communicate an understanding among their generals. That's why things like the Israeli Declaration of Independence might have sent one message to the Arabs, whilst the actions on the ground were saying something different. And what's his response to this?
Now, I can go on to debunk most of his claims. I can refute each of his quotes with one of my own.
I mean, of course. Trust me, bro. I could debunk you if I wanted to, but I won't. Really? I feel like this is a pretty big point of contention, no? First of all, if I can show Zionist leaders saying things about removing non-Jews from the land, you can't really debunk that just by using counterquotes. They've literally said the thing that you're claiming they didn't. And no examples of Ben-Gurion having personal dilemmas in his diary or in letters to his son are going to undo that. It is true that some leaders avoided being too public about their desires. Others gave contradictory messages depending on who they were speaking to, but on the whole, Ben-Gurion, and in fact most of the Zionist leaders throughout the 30s and 40s, went on the record supporting the idea of removing Arabs. Traveling Israel said he could debunk this if he wanted to, but in this video, he doesn't. Instead, and you might see a pattern emerging here, he goes on to regurgitate the exact same talking points as he does in his older video.
In the Israeli declaration, it says, "We appeal in the very midst of the onslaught launched against us now for months to the Arab inhabitants of the State of Israel to preserve peace and participate in the upbuilding of the state on the basis of full and equal citizenship. We extend our hand to all neighboring states and their people in an offer of peace and good neighborliness and appeal to them to establish bonds of cooperation," and so on. I find it extremely noble that in the middle of the fighting, when Arab leaders were talking about the annihilation of the Jews, the Israelis said they want peace, and they acted on it. 160,000 Arabs who didn't participate in the battles against the Jews kept on living in Israel.
So, once again, this does not address anything I said about expulsions in my video. He's just repeating the exact same point as before. The Zionist leaders definitely didn't want to expel the Arabs. You can tell because they said so in the Declaration of Independence, whilst the Arabs were being expelled. And just as a side note, in case he's never mentioned it, this declaration is only a set of guiding principles. It isn't legally binding, but at this point, I do have to wonder, is Traveling Israel broken? Is he just programmed to regurgitate the same shallow collection of bullet points regardless of what he's responding to? Well, maybe. But at points, it does feel like he's being intentionally dishonest. For example, when he says this.
I want to bring another Benny Morris quote that Lonobox chose not to include that in a way summarizes it all. There was no Zionist plan or blanket policy of evicting the Arab population or of ethnic cleansing. And the demonization of Israel is largely based on lies, much as the demonization of the Jews during the past 2,000 years has been based on lies, and there is a connection between the two.
Now, I have no idea why he's acting like this particular quote changes anything about what I said. Did he forget that my video also featured a quote from Benny Morris saying basically the same thing? Except you'll notice that the one I used actually elaborates on the fact that although Ben-Gurion didn't make an expulsion policy, he still preferred that his soldiers understood what he wanted, that being to live in a state with as few Arabs as possible. What he did seem to have an issue with was having his desires put down as a blanket policy that would have put him down in history as the Great Expeller. But if you'd only watched Traveling Israel's video, you wouldn't know about this part, and this would make it look like he was revealing something that I had chosen to hide. But why does Traveling Israel seem to prefer this quote over this one? Again, I'm no mind reader, but I'm guessing it's because if you only read the first one, devoid of any context, Israel looks completely innocent. If you read this one, not so much. And since I might as well match his energy, here is a Benny Morris quote that Traveling Israel chose not to include in his video. At no point during the 1930s and 40s did Ben-Gurion ever go on the record against the idea or policy of transfer. On the contrary, Ben-Gurion left a paper trail a mile long as to his actual thinking, and no amount of ignoring, twisting and turning, manipulation, contortion and distortion can blow it away. And given that this is literally the leader of the Zionist movement at the time, it does kind of stand in contrast to this, doesn't it? And again, just for good measure, here is an even bolder claim coming out of Benny Morris's own human face.
And so accrued, as I say, a third element in terms of Jewish war aims in the war, which was to reduce the number, if you like, to expel part of the Palestinian population from those areas which were to become Jewish, sovereign Jewish territory.
So not every Israeli historian agrees with this point. Traveling Israel definitely doesn't. And I did challenge him to explain exactly why he thinks this, but again, he didn't address it. Apart from, I guess, they didn't want to remove the Arabs because the Declaration of Independence that wasn't legally binding said so. Give me a fucking break. There were a few other points he made in his video that I haven't mentioned here, mostly because I just considered them either petty or irrelevant to any of my arguments, but don't take my word for it though. You can feel free to watch the whole thing yourself. As a final note, I've also seen a lot of people suggesting me and him have a debate. Obviously, my viewers would say that. I did send him an email asking if he was up for a conversation, but he said no, which is fine, by the way. No one here is entitled to anyone else's time, so I'm not going to make a big deal out of that. Once again, special thanks to Al, Garner Haney, and Maruzzi. Anyway, bye.